Hey, amazing viewers. Before we go into this riveting narrative, drop your location in the comments below. We love connecting with you all around the world. Also, if this is your first time here, press the subscribe button and join our incredible journey. Let's hit 10,000 subscribers this month together. Your support means everything. A fear greater than heights. The air inside the terminal was thick with anticipation. The steady hum of rolling suitcases, the sharp clatter of heels against tile, and the constant murmur of voices filled the space. To most, it was just another airport, another flight, another destination. But for 12-year-old Ethan Carter, it felt like the edge of a cliff, one he was terrified to step off. Ethan had always been fascinated by the sky, but only from the ground. Looking up, he admired the planes streaking across the clouds like silver birds, but the thought of being inside one, that sent a cold shiver down his spine. His fear of heights was no secret, at least not to himself. He never told anyone, not even his mother, and especially not his grandfather, Richard Carter, the man who had spent his entire life in the skies. Richard was more than just Ethan's grandfather. He was his hero. A retired commercial pilot, Richard had once flown some of the world's biggest jets. His stories were legendary, tales of navigating through thunderstorms, landing in impossible conditions, and soaring above the clouds like a true adventurer. But the greatest lesson he ever taught Ethan wasn't about flying. It was about courage. Courage isn't about being fearless, kid, he would say with a wink. It's about being scared and doing it anyway. Those words clung to Ethan like a second skin. But today, as he stood at the departure gate gripping his boarding pass, he felt anything but courageous. His mother knelt beside him, her expression gentle but firm. "Ethan, honey, I know this is hard," she said, squeezing his shoulders. "But Grandpa needs us. We have to go." He looked up at her, swallowing the lump in his throat. What if something happens? His voice was barely above a whisper. She brushed a strand of hair from his forehead, her gaze steady. "Then we'll face it together. Just like Grandpa always says, bravery isn't about not being afraid. It's about not letting fear stop you." Ethan's stomach churned, but he nodded. He had to do this. For Richard. As they stepped onto the jet bridge, his legs felt heavier with each step. The plane loomed ahead, its white body reflecting the morning sun. Passengers shuffled forward, chatting casually, some already lost in their phones. To them, this was routine. To Ethan, it felt like stepping into the unknown. He took a deep breath and crossed the threshold. A flight like no other. The cabin smelled of new leather and fresh coffee. Flight attendants greeted them with bright smiles, their uniforms crisp and reassuring. Ethan followed his mother down the narrow aisle, his fingers gripping the strap of his backpack like a lifeline. They reached their row. Seat 12A, window. He hesitated. "You can take the aisle," his mother offered gently. Ethan shook his head. No, if he was going to do this, he had to face it. Sliding into the seat, he buckled in, feeling the unfamiliar tightness of the seatbelt across his lap. His hands trembled slightly as he gripped the armrests. The overhead announcements droned on, the safety demonstration playing on the small screen in front of him. Then came the moment he dreaded. The engines roared to life. His breath hitched. The hum grew into a growl, a deep, vibrating force that seemed to shake the entire plane. He clutched the armrest tighter. His heart pounded against his ribs. "It's okay," his mother whispered beside him. "Just breathe." Ethan inhaled sharply through his nose, exhaling slowly, trying to steady himself. The plane began taxiing, the movement smooth but unsettling. Outside the window, the runway stretched long and endless, leading toward the unknown. Then, without warning, the plane surged forward. The force pushed him back into his seat. The engines roared louder. The nose lifted, and suddenly, his stomach dropped. They were airborne. A change in perspective. Ethan clenched his eyes shut. The sensation of leaving the ground sent panic crawling up his spine. He had read somewhere that airplanes were the safest way to travel, but his mind refused to believe it. Then he heard something. Laughter. He cracked one eye open. Across the aisle, a toddler was giggling, clapping her tiny hands as if this were the greatest ride of her life. Ethan blinked. How was she not scared? Slowly, he turned to the window. What he saw took his breath away. The world had shrunk below them. The city, the streets, the cars, they were nothing more than tiny specks against the earth. Above, the sky stretched into an endless ocean of blue, vast and infinite. The sun glowed warmly over the horizon, painting the clouds in streaks of gold and pink. It wasn't terrifying. It was beautiful. For the first time, something shifted inside him. His fear, though still present, was no longer in control. A flicker of wonder took its place. Maybe Grandpa was right, he thought. Maybe up here, you really are closer to the stars. But just as he was beginning to settle, something happened that would change everything. An unexpected crisis. The pilot's voice crackled over the intercom. Ladies and gentlemen, we hope you're enjoying the flight. We're currently cruising at 30,000 feet and should be arriving on time. Please sit back, relax, and enjoy the journey. Ethan let out a breath, loosening his grip on the armrest. Maybe, just maybe, he could do this. And then, a sharp jolt rocked the plane. The overhead lights flickered. The hum of the engines faltered. Then, an eerie silence. Passengers murmured in confusion. Flight attendants exchanged glances, their smiles tightening into something less certain. Ethan's pulse spiked. He turned to his mother. What's happening? Before she could answer, another announcement came, but this time, it wasn't from the captain. It was from a flight attendant, her voice laced with a tension she tried to mask. Ladies and gentlemen, if we could have your attention, please. Our pilots have become unresponsive. We are currently attempting to establish contact with ground control. The words hit Ethan like a punch to the gut. The pilots, unresponsive. The murmurs grew into panicked whispers. A woman gasped. A businessman slammed his laptop shut, eyes wide. The flight attendants moved quickly, speaking in hushed tones, trying to maintain order. Ethan's chest tightened. This wasn't turbulence. This was something else. His mother reached for his hand, squeezing it tightly. Stay calm, she whispered, but he could hear the fear in her voice. The plane, once steady, felt like a ticking clock, a heartbeat away from disaster. And then, in the midst of the chaos, a flight attendant's voice rang out. Is there anyone on board with piloting experience? Silence. No hands, no voices, no one. Ethan's heart pounded. And then, something stirred in him. A memory. His grandfather's voice, strong and unwavering. Courage, my boy, isn't the absence of fear. It's moving forward even when fear tries to stop you. He took a deep breath, and for the first time in his life, he raised his hand. The moment that changed everything. The cabin fell into an eerie stillness, a sharp contrast to the chaos bubbling beneath the surface. Faces were frozen in shock, eyes darting between the flight attendants and each other, searching for an answer that wasn't there. The flight attendant's plea still echoed in the air. Is there anyone on board with piloting experience? Silence. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest like a war drum. The world around him seemed to slow, sounds muffled as his mind raced through memories of the man who had taught him everything he knew about courage, his grandfather, Richard Carter. No one was standing up. The realization hit Ethan like a jolt of electricity. There were millionaires on this plane, people who had lived lives of power and privilege, but none of them knew how to fly. There were businessmen, celebrities, executives, people who had conquered boardrooms, industries, and stock markets, but not the sky. A new fear settled into his gut, different from the one that had gripped him before. This wasn't just about being afraid of heights anymore. This was life and death. He turned to his mother, her face pale, her grip on his hand firm yet trembling. In her eyes, he saw the same unspoken truth. No one was coming to save them. Unless. He swallowed hard. His throat felt like sandpaper. His palms were sweaty. Every instinct screamed at him to stay silent, to let someone else fix this. But no one else would. Somewhere deep within, a voice whispered, a voice that sounded a lot like Richard Carter. Courage, my boy, isn't the absence of fear. It's moving forward even when fear tries to stop you. Before he knew what he was doing, his hand was in the air. Gasps rippled through the cabin. The flight attendants whipped around, their expressions shifting from desperation to shock. Ethan's voice barely made it past the lump in his throat. I can help. Eyes locked onto him from every direction. Whispers spread like wildfire. A kid, someone muttered. Is this a joke? Another voice scoffed. He's just a child. A well-dressed businessman 3 rows ahead frowned deeply, shaking his head. This isn't the time for games, kid. Ethan's face burned with embarrassment, his nerves screaming at him to lower his hand. But then, something unexpected happened. A stewardess rushed to his side, kneeling to meet his eyes. She wasn't dismissive. She wasn't skeptical. She was desperate. You know how to fly? She asked, breathless. Ethan hesitated. Did he? Not exactly. But he had spent years absorbing his grandfather's stories, listening to every lesson about aerodynamics, controls, altitude, and emergency landings. He had spent hours watching Richard in flight simulators, explaining every button, every dial, every calculation. He didn't have the training. He didn't have the experience. But he had knowledge. And right now, that was more than anyone else had. He squared his shoulders. I don't know everything, but my grandpa, he's a pilot. He taught me a lot. I know how things work. I can help. The flight attendant took a shaky breath. Right now, I'll take any help we can get. Before Ethan could second-guess himself, he was being pulled toward the cockpit. His mother's voice rang behind him. Frightened, uncertain. Ethan, wait. But he didn't stop. Inside the cockpit. The second he stepped into the cockpit, Ethan felt small. The space was cramped, filled with buttons, levers, and digital screens blinking with an intensity that made his head spin. The seats were empty, both pilots slumped over, unconscious. His stomach twisted. This was real. A flight attendant was already on the radio, her voice urgent. Ground control, do you read me? We have an emergency. Both pilots are unconscious, and we have no one to fly the plane. A burst of static. Then a voice crackled through the speakers. This is air traffic control. Who am I speaking with? The flight attendant hesitated. My name is Amanda. I'm a flight attendant. We don't have a pilot. A passenger, a boy, says he knows something about flying. Silence. Then the voice returned, slower this time. A boy. Ethan grabbed the headset, ignoring the stunned looks from the flight crew. His hands were shaking, but his voice, somehow, was steady. My name is Ethan Carter. My grandpa's a pilot. I don't know how to land this plane, but I know enough to help. There was another pause. Then, surprisingly, the voice didn't sound doubtful. It sounded calm. All right, Ethan. My name is Doug. I'm going to help you. First things first, take a deep breath. Ethan inhaled sharply, exhaling slowly. Good. Now, tell me what you see. He scanned the control panel, his brain working faster than it ever had before. He spotted the autopilot system still engaged, the altitude holding at 35,000 feet. That was good. It meant they weren't in free fall. But then his eyes landed on something that sent his stomach plummeting. The fuel gauge. It was dropping. Fast. His voice wavered. We're losing fuel. The air traffic controller's voice tightened. All right, Ethan. We're going to work together. We'll get through this. Ethan's heart pounded. He wasn't just a scared kid anymore. He was the only chance this plane had. And failure. Failure wasn't an option. The clock is ticking. Back in the cabin, the passengers were growing restless. The news had spread. A 12-year-old boy was in the cockpit. Some were outraged. A child is flying this plane. This is madness. We're doomed. Others, however, sat in stunned silence. A few even looked hopeful. Ethan's mother sat in her seat, hands clenched into fists. She had spent her entire life protecting her son, shielding him from the worst of the world. Now she could only watch as he stepped into the most dangerous moment of his life. But she saw something in him she had never seen before. Not fear. Strength. In the cockpit, Ethan swallowed hard. His fingers hovered over the controls as air traffic control guided him step by step. He could barely breathe. Doug's voice was calm but firm. "Ethan, listen to me. You're doing great. Now, we need to check your altitude and start preparing for descent." Ethan's breath hitched. Descent. That meant one thing. He was going to have to land this plane. The thought sent a fresh wave of terror through him. "You can't do this. You're just a kid. This is impossible." Then he remembered his grandfather's voice. "Courage, my boy, isn't the absence of fear. It's moving forward even when fear tries to stop you." Ethan straightened in the pilot's seat, his grip tightening. "I'm ready," he said. And this time, he meant it. The cockpit smelled like metal and burnt coffee, the air thick with the tension of 1,000 unsaid words. Ethan's fingers trembled over the controls, his breath uneven. The radio crackled again, the voice from air traffic control slicing through the silence like a lifeline. "Ethan, I need you to stay with me, okay? We're going to get you through this." Ethan nodded, even though Doug couldn't see him. He had never been this scared before. Not even when he had stood on the observation deck of the Empire State Building last summer, his legs shaking as he looked down. That fear had been different, distant, safe, with guardrails between him and the fall. But now, there was nothing between him and disaster except the controls of a real, actual, flying airplane. He glanced at the pilot slumped beside him, his head resting lifelessly against the panel. The co-pilot, too, was out cold, their bodies motionless, helpless. The flight attendants had tried waking them, shaking their shoulders, splashing them with water. Nothing. They were on their own, and Ethan was the one sitting in the pilot's seat. He swallowed hard, gripping the yoke tighter. "Doug, how long do we have?" There was a pause before the answer came. "Ethan, I won't lie to you. Your plane is losing fuel at a faster rate than normal. You have about 30 minutes before you'll be forced to land, whether you're ready or not." Ethan's stomach flipped. 30 minutes. That wasn't a lot of time. His hands were already sweating as Doug's voice continued. "Now I want you to look at the central control panel. Do you see the autopilot button?" Ethan's eyes darted across the blinking lights, searching. His grandfather had once explained how autopilot worked, how it kept planes steady even when pilots weren't touching the controls. He had thought it was cool back then. Now it was all that was keeping them from disaster. He found the button, glowing green. "I see it," he confirmed. "Good. You're going to need to switch to manual control soon, but we don't want to rush it. Right now, just focus on maintaining altitude." Ethan exhaled slowly. Maintain altitude. Keep them steady. He could do that. Fear has no place in the sky. Back in the cabin, the passengers were still panicking. The news had spread like wildfire. A 12-year-old boy was flying the plane. A woman in a fur coat had broken into hysterics, crying into her designer handbag. A businessman in first class was angrily demanding to speak to the flight crew. People were murmuring, whispering, terrified. But amid the chaos, one voice cut through it all. "He's Richard Carter's grandson." Heads turned toward the source of the words, a man in his 60s, wearing an old aviation pin on his jacket. His name was Frank Dawson, a retired air marshal who had once flown alongside Ethan's grandfather. "Richard Carter," a passenger echoed. Frank nodded. "The best pilot I ever knew. If that kid learned from him, Then we've got a chance. A silence settled over the cabin. Hope, fragile but present, flickered through the crowd. Ethan's mother, sitting in her seat with her hands clasped tightly together, whispered, "Come on, hey. You can do this." Taking control. Doug's voice came through the headset again. "All right, Ethan, listen to me carefully. You're going to take control of the plane. That means switching off autopilot." Ethan's heart nearly stopped. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "I wouldn't ask you to do this if I didn't believe in you." Ethan squeezed his eyes shut for a moment, his grandfather's words echoing in his mind. Courage isn't about not being scared. It's about what you do despite it. He exhaled sharply, then reached out, hovering his finger over the autopilot button. Click. The green light switched off. Instantly, the plane responded. The yoke became heavier in his hands. The aircraft swayed slightly, no longer guided by invisible hands. Ethan's breath hitched. He was flying this plane. Doug's voice remained steady. "Good job, Ethan. Now I want you to keep your hands on the yoke. Apply gentle pressure, smooth movements. Try to keep her steady." Ethan did as he was told, adjusting his grip. The plane felt alive now. He could feel every tiny movement, every adjustment in air pressure. It was overwhelming, but also exhilarating. He was doing it. His mother's voice crackled through the radio, barely holding back tears. "Ethan, I'm so proud of you." He bit his lip, blinking hard. He couldn't afford to get emotional right now. "Doug," he said, voice stronger this time. "What's next?" "The descent begins." Doug didn't hesitate. "Ethan, you need to prepare for descent. Look at the instrument panel. Do you see the altitude gauge?" Ethan found it immediately. His heart pounded. They were still high. Too high. "You're at 35,000 feet. We need to get you down to 10,000 feet before we start the final approach." Ethan took another breath. He could do this. Doug continued, guiding him through every step. "Adjust the throttle. Lower the altitude. Keep the nose level." The plane began to dip. Slowly, steadily. But just as things seemed under control, an alarm blared. Ethan's blood ran cold. The fuel gauge had just hit critical. Doug's voice sharpened. "Ethan, listen to me. We have to land this plane now. We don't have time for a slow descent. You're going to have to make an emergency landing." Ethan's hands trembled. Emergency landing. The words hit like a freight train. He had to do this. He had no choice. Doug's voice remained calm. "There's a runway about 30 miles ahead. I'm redirecting your coordinates. You're going to bring this plane down, Ethan." The plane jolted again. A low warning beep filled the cockpit. The passengers in the cabin clutched their seats, eyes wide with fear. Ethan gritted his teeth. His fear was still there, a gnawing beast in his stomach, but it no longer controlled him. His grandfather's voice echoed in his mind one last time. "Up there, closer to the stars. That's where freedom lives." Ethan took a deep breath, his hands firm on the controls. "Doug, I'm ready." And with that, the boy who had once feared heights prepared to land a plane. The descent into destiny. The plane groaned as it began its final descent, the engines straining against gravity's pull. Ethan's fingers ached from gripping the yoke so tightly, his knuckles white. He had spent his entire life avoiding heights, but now, at 30,000 feet in the air, he was the only thing standing between 200 passengers and disaster. Doug's voice crackled through the radio. "Ethan, listen carefully. You're about to attempt an emergency landing. This is going to be the hardest thing you've ever done, but I need you to trust me." Ethan licked his dry lips, his pulse roaring in his ears. "I trust you, Doug." A beat of silence. Then, Doug's voice steadied, filled with quiet confidence. "Good. Now let's bring this bird home." A plane full of millionaires, and a 12-year-old at the controls. Back in the cabin, the passengers had never been quieter. The reality had set in. A 12-year-old boy was about to land their plane. A woman clutched her diamond necklace, whispering prayers under her breath. A man in a three-piece suit squeezed his eyes shut, murmuring something about stock investments not mattering if you're dead. A billionaire CEO, who had once called himself invincible, held his wife's hand so tightly that his knuckles turned white. Ethan's mother sat frozen in her seat, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She had spent 12 years protecting her son, shielding him from scraped knees and bad dreams. Now there was nothing she could do but watch as he stepped into a role no child should ever have to fill. And yet, she had never been prouder. A retired air marshal, Frank Dawson, stood at the front of the cabin. His voice, once gruff and commanding, softened with something like reverence. If he's anything like his grandfather, he's going to get us home. The final approach. Doug's voice was steady. Ethan, you're at 28,000 feet. We need to drop you to 10,000 before we begin approach. I want you to ease off the throttle. Just a little. Ethan's heart pounded, his fingers moving carefully. He pulled the throttle back, and the plane responded instantly. The nose tipped slightly downward, the speed adjusting. A low warning beep filled the cockpit. Fuel levels critical. Doug's voice sharpened. We're running out of time, kid. You're going to have to take us down faster. Faster. That meant steeper. That meant scarier. Ethan swallowed hard. His grandfather's words echoed in his mind. Sometimes you don't have the luxury of fear, kid. Sometimes you just have to do it. He took a deep breath, then pushed the throttle back further. The plane lurched. Passengers screamed as the plane tilted forward, the descent sharp and fast. Luggage tumbled from overhead bins, drinks spilled. People clung to their seats as gravity pressed against them. Ethan's arms trembled from the effort of keeping the yoke steady. Doug's voice cut through the chaos. That's it. You're doing great, Ethan. Stay with me. The ground below was coming fast. Too fast. The once distant runway was now in sight. Doug's voice held an edge of urgency. I need you to level out. Now. Ethan yanked back on the yoke. The plane shuddered violently. The nose began to lift, but the weight of the descent fought against him. It was like trying to hold back an avalanche with bare hands. The ground was coming too fast. Doug's voice grew sharper. Don't panic, Ethan. You have control. Feel the plane. Guide it. Ethan's heart pounded. His muscles burned. He thought about his grandfather, about the stories he told, the ones where he had landed in the worst storms, in the darkest nights, on runways that barely existed. It's not about what the plane does, kid. It's about what you do. And then, something clicked. The fear didn't vanish, but it no longer mattered. Ethan adjusted the throttle, straightened the nose, and finally, the plane obeyed. They were still coming in too fast, but they were lined up with the runway. The hardest part was coming. Doug's voice was tight. Ethan, you're almost there. You need to lower the landing gear. Do you see the lever? Ethan's eyes darted to the left panel. The landing gear control. He reached out and pulled it down. A loud clunk vibrated through the plane. A warning light flashed on the dashboard. Doug's voice dropped. Brace yourself, kid. This is it. The landing of a lifetime. In the cabin, everyone braced for impact. Some held hands, some whispered final prayers, others simply stared ahead, frozen in the moment between life and death. Ethan's mother had tears streaming down her face, gripping her seat with white-knuckled hands. Frank Dawson stood at the front, unmoving. And in the cockpit, Ethan Carter held the fate of 200 people in his hands. Doug's voice was barely above a whisper now. Flare the nose, Ethan, just before you touch down. Keep her level. You've got this. The runway was rushing toward them. Ethan tightened his grip. He adjusted the yoke. The wheels hovered just above the ground. And then, TUMP. The wheels slammed onto the tarmac, screeching against the asphalt. The plane jolted forward, bouncing slightly as Ethan fought to keep it straight. Brakes, Ethan. Hit the brakes, Doug shouted. Ethan's foot slammed down on the brakes. The engines roared in protest. The force threw passengers forward. Oxygen masks dropped from above. A baby wailed. The plane skidded. For a moment, Ethan thought they were going to overshoot the runway. And then, silence. The plane slowed. Slower. Slower. Then it stopped. For a second, no one moved. Then, in the cabin, someone sobbed. Then, a deafening cheer. People wept, hugged, clapped. Frank Dawson, the old air marshal, stood tall and saluted. And Ethan Carter, he let out a breath. The longest breath of his life. Doug's voice, over the radio, was quiet. "You did it, Ethan." Ethan blinked. His hands were still shaking. His body felt lighter. His fear of heights, gone. He had just done the impossible. And in that moment, Ethan Carter was no longer just a 12-year-old boy. He was a pilot. The sky no longer scares him. The plane sat motionless at the end of the runway, its engines cooling, its tires still warm from the screeching halt. But inside was a different world. The cabin had erupted into pure chaos. Not the kind of chaos fueled by fear, but the kind fueled by relief, by joy, by the raw, overwhelming realization that they had survived. People wept openly, hugging strangers they had never met before. A woman in a designer dress, once too composed to acknowledge anyone around her, had fallen to her knees, whispering prayers of gratitude. A CEO, who had spent his life commanding boardrooms, now wiped his tears with the sleeve of his suit, overcome with emotion. And in the middle of it all, Ethan's mother sat frozen in her seat, staring ahead with wide, glassy eyes. A flight attendant knelt beside her. "Ma'am, are you okay?" She didn't respond. Not at first. Because how could she respond? Her son, her 12-year-old fear of heights son, had just landed a plane. It wasn't until she heard footsteps, his footsteps, that she moved. She turned, and there he was. Ethan stood in the aisle, still in the pilot's seat uniform jacket they had thrown over him, still looking impossibly small for the role he had just played. But something about him had changed. He no longer looked like a boy who feared heights. He looked like a boy who had conquered them. Her breath hitched as she stared at him, her hands trembling. "Ethan." He gave her a small, exhausted smile. "Hey, Mom." That was all it took. She surged forward, wrapping him in the tightest hug of his life. She didn't care about the applause, or the cameras flashing from passengers recording the moment. She didn't care that the world outside was already buzzing with the news of what had just happened. All she cared about was her son. "My brave, brave boy," she whispered, pressing a kiss to his forehead. "I love you so much." Ethan swallowed hard, the weight of everything finally settling into his chest. His arms wrapped around her, holding on like she was the only thing keeping him grounded. "I love you too, Mom." The boy who flew a plane. Outside, emergency vehicles had swarmed the tarmac, their flashing lights reflecting off the fuselage. Reporters were already gathering, their cameras pointed at the aircraft, their microphones ready. By the time the doors opened and passengers began to step onto the stairway leading down, the world had already changed. News anchors shouted over each other. "Breaking news. A 12-year-old boy has landed a plane after both pilots fell unconscious." Unbelievable. Witnesses say the child was the grandson of a legendary retired pilot. A modern-day miracle. A story of bravery, courage, and the impossible made possible. Ethan barely registered any of it, because standing at the bottom of the stairs was his grandfather. His frail frame was leaning against a cane, his once strong hands now wrinkled with time. But his eyes, his sharp, blue, pilot's eyes, were filled with pride. Ethan's breath caught. "Grandpa." Richard Carter lifted his cane in a mock salute. "Well, kid," he smirked. "Took you long enough to get here." A laugh burst from Ethan's lips. It was tired, so incredibly tired, but real. Before he knew it, he was running down the stairs, barreling into his grandfather's arms. Richard let out a breath, wrapping a shaky arm around him. "You did good, kid." His voice cracked. "You did real good." Ethan gripped his grandfather's shirt, squeezing his eyes shut. "I was scared. I know. But I did it anyway." Richard pulled back, his eyes shining. "That's what makes you a Carter. A sky full of dreams." The world didn't stop talking about Ethan Carter. News stations ran the footage for weeks. The story of the 12-year-old who took control of a plane full of millionaires became a sensation. Interviews, documentaries, headlines, it all followed. Aviation schools reached out, offering him scholarships before he was even old enough to attend. Pilots from around the world sent letters, calling him one of their own. And in every interview, every speech, every moment, Ethan said the same thing. "I didn't do it alone." Because he didn't. He had Doug, the air traffic controller who believed in him when the world doubted. He had his mother, who gave him the courage to step forward. He had his grandfather, whose wisdom had prepared him for this moment long before he knew it would come. And most of all, he had himself. The Ethan Carter who had boarded that plane was not the same one who had stepped off. Because that Ethan had been afraid of heights. But the one who landed the plane, the sky no longer scared him. Epilogue, a promise to the stars. Years later, long after the world had moved on, Ethan stood at the cockpit of a new plane. Not as a frightened child, but as a pilot in training. His instructor glanced at him. Nervous, Ethan looked out at the sky, remembering the day he had thought it was the most terrifying place in the world. Now, it just looked like home. He smiled. "No," he said, "not anymore." And with that, Ethan Carter, the boy who had once feared the sky, took flight again. This time, by choice. This concludes the story. Thank you for watching until the end. I hope you found it enjoyable. If you did, please consider liking the video and sharing it with your friends. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and activate the notification bell for more captivating stories. Have a great day.